Happy Friday afternoon, evening, perhaps even Saturday morning, wherever you happen to be in the world, and welcome to another episode of Cinema Crusaders. Before we get into the movie and I introduce my co-host, I do want to do a little housekeeping. I want to apologize to everybody who was waiting for us to do vampires last week, but life intruded, and we've had to postpone that till after the first of the year. But don't worry, we will get to John Carpenter's Vampires, a favorite movie I know for all three of us. And hopefully Lance will be back by then, and we get Lance's opinions on the movie as well. But Lance is off for some well-deserved R&R this weekend. So good luck, Lance. Have fun. Enjoy yourself taking the time off. So this week, we are doing a small independent film by a huge name, Ron Howard. This movie is called Rush. And Rush is a biopic, well, it's not a documentary. It's a somewhat fictionalized accounting of the 1976 title fight between McLaren's James Hunt and Ferrari's Nicki Lauda in Formula One. And for all of you who aren't Formula One fans, I know that I'm a Formula One fan, but I think out of all the three of us who watch this movie, I'm the only one who's a Formula One fan that follows it regularly. So this movie isn't just for Formula One fans. There's a lot to take out of it, and we're going to break that movie down and talk about it and talk about how this was made, because this was an independent film, a film made for $38 million, and it grossed $96 million worldwide. So it grossed a ton of money, but it made its money back and then some, and so I would consider it a success. But before we get into that, I do want to introduce my co-hosts. First, he is the man who loves to play drow female clerics and paladins in D&D, but he's also a writer, a good friend, part of the Sloppy Spoilers podcast. I'm talking about none other than Steve Shadewing Sellers. How you doing, Steve?
Not too bad. I will say this is not like the kind of movie that I normally would go out of my way to watch for a lot of reasons. And actually, kind of my joke of this movie is that this is Thor versus Baron Zemo, except with more driving and less dancing. But it's not too bad. I mean, for it being not my usual fare, I think it turned out pretty decently.
It definitely is a departure from a lot of the stuff that we usually cover, especially lately. But I did want to kind of get your opinions on this, because I think this is a movie, especially if you're into, well, we're going to break it down a little bit, but I think that this could have some appeal. And it's one of those smaller movies that I don't think a lot of people have seen. And I think it would be interesting to a wider audience. So I did want to hear that. And, especially from both of you who are fans of a variety of different genres, and what your takes on it, because I think it'll help our audience understand what this movie is and maybe if they should pick it up. So I'm looking forward to talking about it. All right. So next, I'm going to introduce the yin to my yang, the art director for Moraine Cross Press. He is also a comic book creator of his own comics, including Mr. Happy. And I always forget, I think it's the Sentinels of Liberty, but Jeff will correct me because for some reason it always escapes my mind. But I've seen the stuff for that, and that's awesome as well. He's also a writer on Blood World, an incredibly talented artist. I'm talking about, and he's on Sloppy Spoilers podcast. He's a man who is busy all the time, none other than Jeff, Mr. Happy, and Mr. Fellhand Bracey. How you doing, Jeff?
Go Speed Racer, go Speed Racer, go Speed Racer, go. And it's symbols.
Symbols of liberty.
They're symbols.
Jesus.
They're all the Liberty Bell, the Statue of Liberty, Blind Justice, Uncle Sam, American Bald Eagle. They are the symbols of liberty.
Hey, I'm the American Bald Eagle. Stop stealing my thunder, man.
You've got more hair than my uncle. I'm not a big drama fan, and I didn't know what to expect of this film. I'd never heard of it, so this wasn't even on my radar. That shows you how small this film is. And I do like small and independent films. For instance, I would highly recommend Moon to anybody who hasn't seen it. Really impressive, small budget sci-fi film. But this, I didn't know what to catch out of this until you started talking about it in the chat and whatnot. And I was, okay, it's going to be Days of Thunder, Formula One style. And I'm not a big fan of NASCAR. I know I'm going to lose my South Carolina card for that. But I'm not a big fan of of Formula One either, but I have enjoyed watching it because I appreciate it a little bit more than NASCAR because like our big joke is like, wow, look at that guy turn left. But in Formula One, you actually have a track that requires a great deal of skill to navigate, because you have all these twists and turns that you got, and you're riding in this firebomb little coffin that is a wing. If they hit anything, if their tires touch, if you get any bit of air up under this thing, you take off. I've seen these things fly like, if you watch these videos of like speedboats getting too much air, it's just like that. And it's terrifying in a way like a NASCAR crash can never be. So my hat is off to all the guys who do participate in this sport. And I did not realize the death toll was quite as high as the movie presents. I don't know if that's factual, but I do know if you crack up in one of these things, it is a bad, bad day. But I'm also glad that you recommended this film because, like Steve, it's not necessarily the type of film I go for. I do appreciate dramas when I do find myself watching them. Movies like 8 Pounds or, I'm not into the tear jerkers so much or things that are going to tug at my heartstrings too hard. But this was an impressive, moving film. All credit due to the passion of the cast and the crew, and everybody involved is clearly on every single cell of this. You can see the quality in it, the acting, the directing, the cinematography is mind blowing. I especially love the camera shots from inside the helmets as these guys are driving. Having this close up on their eye and their nose, just like some really, really cool stuff. And I would highly recommend this film to anybody who's not just a fan of indie, but who's just a fan of film, period.
Absolutely. I will say, you mentioned the death toll. The death toll was that high. After, in the 80s, a driver named Jackie Stewart issued in a lot of safety regulations to help make it safer. But it wasn't till Ayrton Senna died in the mid 90s that the sport actually stopped being what I would consider a blood sport. So but the death tolls in the 50s and 60s and early 70s was actually that high. You could expect 1 or 2 people to die usually every year across the formula. So it was pretty bad. So, and I think that really gets into what the story, it's not central to the story, death, but I think how you approach death and how you approach life is kind of central to the story. And it's strange. It is a Formula One movie, but I would almost say that Formula One is the backdrop of the movie versus contrasting 2 characters. And the first one is Chris Hemsworth. Go ahead.
It's the vehicle for these men's personal philosophies.
Yeah. And the first person, and so I think we can't talk about what the movie's about without breaking down these characters. So let me introduce the characters real quick, and then I want to go around the horn with you guys talking about them in the movie and then the actors who portrayed them. The first is, I'm kind of torn on who to go first, but I think I'm going to go with the larger-than-life guy first. So let's go with James Hunt. He was a British driver. He drove for McLaren. He also drove for Hesketh. And that is a whole other story that I'm sure we could talk about a little bit about the whole Hesketh team and Lord Hesketh and Sex, the Breakfast of Champions. I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about there, which was true. They actually did have coveralls, racing overalls that said Sex, the Breakfast of Champions on them. But James Hunt is played by Chris Hemsworth. And I think Steve's point is absolutely true. This movie came out shortly after Avengers. And Hemsworth really does play Hunt as Thor from the first Thor movie before he's humbled. So, with all of that entails. So with that, I kind of want to hand it over to Steve to talk about a little about what you thought about Hemsworth's performance, about James Hunt, and about his role in the movie. And then we'll go around the horn a little bit about that. And then we'll get to Daniel Bruhl's character. So. Oh, Steve?
Are you muted? Did we lose you? Got your avatar. Not hearing anything.
I don't see it vibrating, so I'm not sure if he's hearing us.
Yeah, like we don't see
All right.
any speech, so I guess
Well, I'll throw it to Jeff.
yeah.
What did you think?
Steve, if you can hear us, reload or something.
Yeah.
The American in me has to appreciate a guy with that kind of swagger because Hemsworth is Australian, and one of the things like here in the States we love Aussies because they have a similar sort of swagger.
Mm-hmm.
You feel like that manly man, that whole Crocodile Dundee. It appeals to the John Wayne that's in the American DNA. And but we're kind of weird because we also love an underdog, having originally been an underdog country. So there's a part of me that liked Hunt right away for his bombacity and his bravado, and there's another part of me that's like our little German friend, like, oh, this guy's a real asshole. And so but what we can't appreciate is if you look at some of the greats in history and sports, you get somebody like a Muhammad Ali who was just a motor mouth, but he could back it up.
Mm-hmm.
And Hunt could back it up. So you have to respect that. So a guy who can be that obnoxious can win you over.
Although,
yeah, go ahead.
I will say real quick, I don't really get into this in the movie, but Hunt's official nickname was Hunt the Shunt. Shunt is a word used in Formula One for crash because he either won a race or crashed. That was the way he raced. So
yeah,
he's definitely very all or nothing. He reminds me of another sports drama I watched, which was about long distance runner Steve Prefontaine, who did not believe in pacing himself. He always believed in giving 100% into a race, and so he would often lose races because he would gas out, and these other people would kind of pace himself. But he felt like everybody should just go as hard as they could the whole race. He felt like that was the true test, and I feel something similar here with Hunt, and so I can definitely respect that. And that's funny, Hunt the Shunt. So yeah. So he worked hard, he played hard, like he lived by those rules, whether it was in the in the cockpit of the car or out in the real world. And that's where I find the failing with the man, because he tried to live larger than life. And it is like I'm going to judge the character, not necessarily the actual person, because don't know, wasn't in his shoes.
mm-hmm.
But as the character, you see things like, oh, and I have to go with Lauder's like points, trying to tell us like, there's life is precious. It's worth slowing down every now and then and appreciating. And James destroyed a lot of his relationships because he was always that rolling stone that will never gather any moss.
And he died. He
died young. Unsurprisingly, he died young. Like as soon as as soon as Lauder saying in the film, like, oh, died before you a heart attack, he wasn't surprised. Like, neither was I. That guy literally partied himself to death, and that's a shame because we've also lost some great talents like that over the years. If you look at people like Chris Farley or John Belushi, people who coincidentally were also superstars, because that's a nickname one of his managers gives him in the film. So, but I guess some people are just like that. They're meant to burn hot and bright and quickly.
Absolutely.
They just blaze into our lives like a comet, and then they're gone.
I think one of the things that's, I think, illustrative of Hunt is the first time we meet him, he walks into a hospital barefoot and his overalls bloody.
Yes.
And he's got a wound in his side. And why does he have a wound in his side? Because he was attacked by another driver because he was screwing that guy's wife.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, Steve, what did you think of James Hunt, the character, and also Chris Hemsworth's portrayal of him, and how James Hunt, progressed through the movie? So,
I hated James Hunt at first, like in the least the fictionalized version of him that we see in this movie. Mm-hmm. Absolutely hated him. He comes across as a complete asshole. I mean, whether it's the womanizing, getting the fights with other drivers, any of the number of the other things that this guy does, he's. I think you described him really well, Nem, with the term wastrel. That's what this guy is. I mean, he's basically like Robert Baratheon from Game of Thrones. I mean, this guy was talented. He did great things. But then what did he do after that? He pretty much just, drank and, slept with everybody in the world and, smoked is, like a chimney and all these other things. And he was just generally self-destructive. And once he had achieved what he wanted to achieve, he just tuned out and said, yeah, I don't care. But I will say that in this movie, I feel like the Hunt character does grow a little bit. Like, he doesn't grow completely, but he grows a little bit. And a lot of that is his relationship with Landa, who he comes to respect as a rival and then as a friend. And you gradually kind of see that evolution, with their relationship, because they're the only ones who really kind of understand each other, and they respect each other for what they're able to do. Because they're the only ones who really understand what it is to be behind the cockpit of a car and just give it that much. Now with Hemsworth, I will say it's very easy to dismiss him as, okay, he's kind of playing Thor. To some extent, he is. There is a bit of the early Thor from the original movie, where he's swaggering and arrogant and, living it up and having all the meat and the party life. But I feel like that's not all that the Hunt that he plays is. And you do get to see the ups and downs of the character. And I think that Hemsworth does, give the character subtlety, in the darker performances, or at least the darker moments or the more serious moments. And then he gets to one of my favorite scenes in the movie, which is he punches out that journalist because he was disrespecting Landa. Yeah, and I'm just like, it didn't happen apparently, but I kind of wish it did, because that was I think that was the moment that kind of solidified their friendship. That this guy is willing to go out of his way and assault this dude, over a disrespect to a guy who was his friend, and I just feel like that kind of shows, I think, perfectly the evolution of the character. But at the same time, you really see that Hunt does learn a little bit from Landa here and there as well. He drives a little bit more carefully in that last race, if you'll notice. Not enough that he's not willing to give like about almost 100%, but I think he gives like maybe 95. Just to be at that little bit of caution, because he feels responsible for what happened to Landa, and and he's sort of saying, it could be me, that's in the burn ward instead of him. So I feel like that, like, you get that real story there with him. He becomes more of a champion. Not a point where I think it completely redeems his character, but at least it makes him interesting and it makes him a little more likable.
I think for me, one of the things that I took out of this movie that I think is pretty fascinating with the character and then Hemsworth's performance is that James Hunt is really a tragedy, because here was a man who was supremely talented and supremely scared of life, in my opinion. And I think that Hemsworth plays that perfectly, and the writers captured that. And the fact that, for instance, it is true that before every race he threw up. So he threw on a face, a bravado for the world, but he was every bit as conscious of the dangers that Lauda was. However, he chose to live this way because, I'm always going to say, with a reckless disregard, it really goes into that wastrel sense where there is nothing else that I could do with my life. I refuse to be the person that my family wants me to be. And so the only thing I could do is thrust myself into the world recklessly this way and try and put my mark on the world before I die. And then when he does, that's enough for him.
Yeah, he achieved exactly what he wanted to achieve. So I guess it's no surprise that he died young. Like he had a goal and he got to it. And I particularly like the scene where they're having the press conference. And like you said, Hemsworth would throw little things in, like not just the historical vomiting, but you see him fidget with things. And like in the particular press conference where he is just maniacally fidgeting with his lighter, you know how scared he is in that moment.
Yeah.
But it's under the table. Nobody else can see it.
And it's like, I don't want to psychoanalyze someone that I never met who has been long dead. And as far as I know, was never psychoanalyzed, plus this is a movie. But if I had to guess, I would
analyze the character.
Yeah, I could analyze the character. I would guess that a lot of this he was doing in order to feel alive, which is a little bit sad because that's the kind of thing you do when you have depression or self-esteem issues and things like that. You know,
I mean, that's why some people are adrenaline junkies.
Mm-hmm. So I think that comes off brilliantly, and I think, like you said, I think Hemsworth does that really well. And in those moments when he's alone with himself, you could tell that he is not comfortable in his own skin, being alone with himself. He drinks, he's quiet, his demeanor changes, and I think Hemsworth brings that along very well. So I thought that was very interesting. Versus Nicki Lauda, who we're going to talk about next, played by Daniel Bruhl, who is arrogant in a completely different way. It's an arrogance born out of competence, I think. I think it's an arrogance born out of, I don't think he's got a whole lot of people skills, but I think he recognizes that, you know, and there's a whole, you know, he burns bridges in his own way. But I think one of my favorite lines of Daniel Bruhl as Nicki Lauda is, "God bless me with an ass that could tell what is happening in a race car."
Yeah, I love that line. It's like, my brain's not so much, but my ass is a genius.
Yeah, you know, so I thought that was absolutely fantastic. But you know, you contrast, you know, and this is, I think, what the heart of the movie is. You contrast two men who are arrogant and to a certain extent had a right to be arrogant because they were very talented at what they did, but arrogant in completely different ways, and their philosophies on life were completely different. So with that, I'm going to go to Steve next. What did you think of Daniel Bruhl's character, Nicki Lauda, in the movie?
I really liked his character. Now, I will say, yeah, I think definitely he's arrogant. He definitely shows kind of that moment. And he's kind of arrogant in a Sherlock Holmes way, where it's like he knows what he knows, you know, and he really doesn't care to sugarcoat anything. You know, he's just going to tell you how he thinks it is, and he doesn't care how it affects people.
If I could interject real quick,
sure.
And then you can go on. There's a scene in the movie, and I don't know if you two remember, where the first time he shows up at Ferrari and he's testing his Ferrari in Monza, which is where the Ferrari is located, the Ferrari factory. That actually happened. Enzo Ferrari, the guy who created the Ferrari brand, was sitting there during testing, and Nicki Lauda actually went around and pulled up, and in front of Enzo Ferrari, the guy who fired everybody,
was telling him the car shit.
Yeah, said the car is shit. And Enzo Ferrari said, "That's fine. We'll make the fixes you said. If they don't make the car go faster, you're fired. Get the hell out of here." And they went faster.
I believe he said that was fair. Yeah.
Yeah. But that actually happened. So sorry to interrupt, but that's the kind of arrogance we're talking about. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's the arrogance of somebody who knows what he's doing and really doesn't, you know, care to sugarcoat it. And he doesn't, you know, he likes, you know, things working. He likes, you know, being competent about it. And I think in a very Austrian way, this is somebody who is very concerned about details and making sure that everything, all the little pieces fit. There's definitely that aspect.
I will say,
he comes from a upper middle class background.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say This is a guy that comes from a family of stockbrokers, and you know he's been accustomed to living in a certain lifestyle, and because of that, he has a certain level of upper class sort of airs about him, and I think that also comes across as arrogance. But I think the real element of arrogance is really more that I know my stuff better than you do, and I don't really particularly care to be nice about it.
I will say that the family backgrounds of the two are somewhat similar in that they both came from fairly well-to-do families. In fact, Nicki Lauda's family was more well-to-do than James Hunt's family was. They were politicians and bankers. However, his family disowned him because he wanted to be a race car driver. And so
he mentions
on his own. Yeah.
He mentions to Hunt in the film that we're both so similar. We both, you know, cut ourselves off from our families to do this thing that we want to do.
Yeah, but whereas Nicki Lauda, you know, invested in himself by taking out loans and cutting shrewd business deals, James Hunt hooked up with Sir Lord Hesketh, who was very much from the British aristocracy, which is where British race car driving came from. I don't want to give you a whole history on race car driving in Great Britain, but I mean, that traditionally was where race car driving started, and then it became more of a more commonplace among the regular people. But, you know, and so they were going to races and eating caviar and drinking champagne and smoking dope and eating lobster and, all of this stuff, so that was very different than Lauda. So who was, working late and trying to improve the car all the time. And James Hunt really wasn't that kind of driver. So two very different people. Steve, what did you think? Or Jeff, what did you think of Daniel Bruhl as Nicki Lauda in the movie?
Like Steve, I immediately liked him, despite the fact that if I'd met him in person, I might have been a bit put off by him.
Mm-hmm.
But as a character, I appreciate him right away because I even with the fact of him being Austrian, he's like the most German I've met since Chris Buse. There's something to be said for that. And there's this stereotype of German engineering and German precision and German attention to details, and he's got all of that in spades. So yeah, he does have that Sherlock Holmesian just frontal lobe knowledge, and I love the fact that when he decided to do this, I imagine he studied every single aspect he could of the engineering of these vehicles. Before we even see him, when Hemsworth is asking like, "Who's the new guy?" He says like, "Oh, that's Nicki Lauda." Well, what's he been doing? I was like, "Oh, he's been here since 5 o'clock, walking the track." It's like a pro golfer. You see him like studying the lay of the land to figure out how the balls were going to roll. So this guy has walked the track who knows how many times, and he's looking at every little defect, every little curve. He's going through it in the way that we kind of see Hunt do later on in the film, where he's like imagining the race and imagining all the turns and everything he needs to do. So I imagine Lauda is doing that himself, but in an even more intense sort of way, because Hunt is clearly not mechanically inclined. You never see any indication of that. He probably knows his vehicle well, but he's not going to engineer it, not like Lauda did. So, given his background, like I said, this is not something they were into. Like you said, they're financiers and politicians, all that. So this guy taught himself. He went out, he found people, he learned, he knew precisely how to make those cars better.
I will also say that Lauda, later on in life, would go on. Mercedes came back into Formula One a little over a decade ago, and they were struggling, and they brought Lauda in to Mercedes, and he improved that car to the point where once they brought Lewis Hamilton in to drive, they won 7 championships in a row. So,
I mean, like the genius, like that really, says something about that. Is like when they're talking about like, oh, the car's too heavy, I need more horsepower. And he has knowledge like the mechanics don't. He's like, have you tried making the parts out of magnesium?
Mm-hmm.
And they're all like, oh, that's a revelation. That shows you the depth of study he's put into this.
Well, also, and he knew about the weight and a whole host of factors, that.
Yeah, so I really appreciated the character because, again, you can be arrogant, but if you can back it up, if you know yourself, if you prove yourself, speaking specifically as an American, I find that the majority of us, like like when the UFC first started, like one of the early guys out of the gate was this fellow named Tank Abbott. He was like a real braggart, and he was like kind of a bully in the ring, and nobody liked him. But the more people he knocked out, the more we got behind him because he could walk the walk as well as talk the talk. So both these guys have that in their own way. And so by the end of the film, I like both of them very much. And it gets to the point where like I cheered Lauda for not finishing the race, and I cheered Hunt for winning the race.
So that's great. That brings me right up to there are 2 critical moments that happen later on in the film. So the first part of the film really just establishes the rivalry, establishes who these 2 are, and kind of follows their careers over 6 years leading up to the title fight in 1976 through junior divisions up into Formula One, and then Hunt moving teams eventually from Hesketh to McLaren, etc. And there's a lot of detail in there, and it's interesting in different ways. But the 2 main events that happened that shaped these 2 people are 2 races in 1976. The first is the Nürburgring, and the second is in Japan at Suzuka. The first incident, and I'm going to go around the horn, starting with Steve, and then I'll go to Jeff. With the Nürburgring, Nicki Lauda was against racing. The meeting that they show in the film actually didn't happen that way. It happened before the race took place. Several months in advance, he just didn't. He wanted the Nürburgring off the calendar period. But they did do the race. It did rain like that, and he did crash. And Nicki Lauda almost died. And he went through hell and returned to racing that year when they thought he was going to die. And it is true that when he regained consciousness, he saw a priest in his room giving him the last rites, and he told the priest to go fuck himself and have his wife come in. So that is an absolutely true story. So the second event is Suzuka, the title decider. Nicki Lauda has come back, and it's raining again, and it's raining really bad. And the race should have been canceled. By everybody who was there, or everybody who's ever seen it, said the race was too dangerous. And they did race because the TV rights had been sold, and everyone wanted to see the fight. And Nicki Lauda pulled over and sacrificed the championship, almost certainly, because he believed it was unsafe. And James Hunt risked everything and went on to win the title in 1976. So those are the two events. So going to Steve first, I want your opinion on the events, how they presented in the movie, and what you thought of the contrast between the two characters in those two events, and Lauda coming back. So,
yeah, I think those particular scenes were handled very, very well. I think the car racing in general is handled very well between the scenes of the actual cars used in the CGI, and then the stock footage or the archival footage that they used. They really, I think, connected those two very, very well. I thought, and it came through very well. In terms of the characters, I feel like, in a way, you start to see in both of these races where each of them is starting to take aspects of the other. Part of the reason why, the reason Lauda ends up getting almost killed is because he was pushing himself to try to pass Hunt. And so he didn't wait long enough for the wheel to be attached properly, and so because of that ends up going and blowing up in his face. So that's the kind of thing that you would expect Hunt would have done. Meanwhile, Hunt, in response to what happens, is actually feels a lot of guilt, understandably, because he was the one that could have stopped the race from happening, and he didn't. And I feel like that is like the turning point in their relationship. And I think that you started to get a little bit of Hunt feeling that this could have been him. And also, feeling, responsible for almost killing a guy that he respects. And also you get towards the end of his recovery, the fact that Landa uses his rivalry with Hunt as a fuel to get out of there and get back into the race. So, all of that is really well done. But then, I think towards the end, it's more like they kind of know when to use those aspects and when not to push them. Mm-hmm. And so you have basically Landa deciding, I'm going to stick to my principles. I'm going to stick to the 20% rule. This is not safe. I'm just going to, I'm just not going to do that because, by that point, he does have a lot to lose. So he plays it safe and he wins because he lives to survive another day. And then Hunt, go ahead.
Go.
No. Go ahead. I need to step out for a second.
Okay, I was gonna say, what you were talking about with Lauda. Lauda, in the crash, actually did inhale flame and some fuel, and he burned the inside of his lungs. They thought he was going to die, and they had to vacuum out the scabs and the burns from his lungs so they could heal. So it is absolutely true that they did that, and this was 1970s technology.
I didn't even know you could do that. That was horrifying.
And it was only supposed to be the medical's advice was to only do this once every couple days so the lungs could heal, and he was forcing them to do it to him 2 and 3 times a day so he could get back in the car. So, Jeff, what did you think of those two scenes and the contrast between the two characters?
Yeah, so it really sums up the nature of these two men and how they they play off each other. And Lauda says something very important towards the end of the film, because he already has the idea that Hunt's not going to push himself anymore. He's gotten what he wanted, but he wants Hunt too, because he says, an enemy brings out the best in you. When when he first gets back on the track, and Hunt comes up to him to apologize very guiltily. He says, I feel like I was responsible. He's like, you were, but you were also responsible for getting me back in the car, because he focused on him the whole time. So I look at both these guys, not just champions for winning, but champions because of who and what they are. I really appreciate people who push themselves beyond their limits. I'll never forget watching Mary Lou Retton at the Olympics. She does a vault and she tears something in her ankle terribly, and they tell her she needs to make another run because they need the points. Mm-hmm. And like, she's in so much pain, and she does it. Like, she runs full out. She does the vault. She lands, and as soon as she sticks the landing, instantly yanks up a foot, and then she kind of falls, and like, she's not walking. She is not walking out of there, and you can see she's trying to smile, but it's one of those smiles where you're like, smile with all the strain and the pain in your face. So I can appreciate Hunt's willingness to go that far, and I also appreciate Lauda's acceptable risks, because again, life is precious, and you can be a champion without having to risk your life. But it shows the dichotomy between the way the two men lived. Hunt only lived for this. He lived for the limelight. As you stated, whenever he's alone, he is awful. He is miserable. He needs an audience all the time, because he can't keep an actual relationship going in his life. Lauda has a wonderful moment with his newlywed wife, talking about how happiness is the enemy, because now I have something to lose. Mm-hmm. And when he thinks about that, he decides, you know what? I've already made my wife suffer greatly. I'm not going to put her through that or worse again. And he knew that the race was super dangerous that day. Live to fight another day.
I can empathize with that as well, a lot, mm-hmm. with that point of view. And I will say that one of the things I take away personally from this movie is that I think if you watch this movie, I think all of us could do to have a little bit of James Hunt in us, just mm-hmm. a little bit, and a lot of Nicki Lauda.
It's an interesting thing, because like when I was, before I realized I was going to be with my wife long term, mm-hmm. I was willing to do a lot more reckless things. I wanted to go skydiving and bungee jumping and a whole bunch of other stuff that I hadn't gotten around to do. A lot of fun, potentially dangerous things on my bucket list. But as soon as I realized there was somebody else attached to my life, all that went out the window. I wasn't willing to do it. And there was a time I was in the hospital, and it was a little touch and go, we'll say. And having my wife sit there beside me in the hospital, and we've got a cat intrusion. 3 days in the hospital, and he knocked out my light. 3 days in the hospital, and she's holding my hand. She says it's like a limp fish. And like on the third day, I was well enough to wrap my fingers around her, and she just kind of let out this little whoop, because that was a sign of life. And I can only imagine she was wondering if she was going to be a widow. So I can empathize. Yeah.
I don't want to make fun of that moment, but when you said that, I was thinking, and on the third day, Gracie wrote, no, sorry.
In triumph.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I think that
usually we don't learn that except by going through youth, when we just recklessly throw our lives at anything, because you have that invincibility of youth, and then as you get a little bit older, you're like, oh well, maybe I should think about things before I do it. So these guys, it's really interesting, because one guy they even tell Hunt is like, Hunt, you need to act like an adult, and he tries to force it by getting married, and he ruins all that. Whereas Lauda, like apparently Lauda feels like he never had a childhood.
I also think that there is a larger statement that Ron Howard and the writer make in this movie at the end, where referencing the scene you're talking about, where Lauda and Hunt meet up and they're talking after the whole race had been won and everything, like the championship had been won. Hunt has this romantic vision of racing.
Yeah.
He has this vision of the racer cheating death, And I will say that this is still present in Formula One and a lot of sports today. It's in football. It's this weird balancing act that we have and across many different things.
There's so many sports where you literally risk yourself. Like my sport of choice is MMA, and one of my favorite fighters, a guy named Michael Bisping, lost an eye, and he didn't let anybody know that he had lost an eye. And he went back and fought his way to the championship once again. And then people found out, you're not allowed to fight anymore, man. Yeah. He's like, yeah, it's all right. I did what I wanted to do.
But I think it's a much bigger statement, because I think it's all about, we respect the people who put it all on the line in a lot of ways. We give them glory for that. It's like in football, going across the middle, receive a pass. It used to be you were risking your life to do that. Someone was going to destroy you.
How many people die climbing Everest every year?
Yeah. And then when the rules change, it's the same thing with baseball, where we used to have a guy, where a catcher would block the plate coming into home plate. And then when they took that away, we as fans were all upset about that. So we're partially to blame as well. I mean, there's a great scene in the movie where a guy asked Lauda for an autograph and asked him to put the date on it, just in case.
That's pretty rude, though, man.
Yeah.
I'm surprised he didn't turn around and deck that dude.
Yeah.
Because I know what you're saying. Because I've watched football games and I'm like, oh wow, they can barely hit each other anymore. Well, that's no fun,
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, we're partially to blame. I mean, what do you think about that, Steve?
Yeah, I think I'm kind of along the lines of the football example. I do watch a fair amount of it, and it's like, yeah, you do kind of want to see, the intense physicality of it, all the action, unscripted and all these things. But then you start realizing why there are rules, and it's because of what happened to Lauda. People get seriously injured doing this. They die doing this, and you kind of understand, like, yeah, we have to start protecting people. And Lauda himself was a big advocate of protecting drivers, and I think that's something that I think is laudable about him.
And even if like in football, as your example, is like, even if they don't die or seriously injured, then we see them on the field. We don't see them 15 years after they retire and they're in a wheelchair or a walker, because they can't walk. So
like I said, being a fan of combat sports, we the studies have come out about like how bad all the concussions are on the behavior and personalities and of football players. The level of punishment they take is like getting in a car crash multiple times a year. And my favorite boxer of all time is Muhammad Ali, and look at how he ended up, because he took a horrible beating and he never bounced back from that.
So that, I think that's one of the things I love about the end there, is that we're really seeing these two, the professional versus the romantic side of these things. And there's just this weird balancing act all the time where we want to be romantic about it and be heroic and lionize these people. But when we do that, a lot of times the very people we're propping up and lionizing will get destroyed performing for us, So it's this weird thing. So
again, like, we're going back to Ali for a second. I saw a clip that I hadn't seen before, and it was really interesting to that point. He talked about how he'd watch fighters be mad at each other and beat the living crap out of each other. And he said, like, that's not the way I'm going to fight. Because Ali was not a strong finisher. He consistently, I don't think he ever threw a body shot that I can remember seeing, but he consistently tap you in the face quite a bit. And that was his whole point. He was going to win on points and leave you as unharmed as possible.
He was
And that just made
finessed.
me made me respect the man all the more.
See, versus all the Mexican fighters are all guys that go out
I'm
there.
going to kill you.
Yeah, they drink, a fifth of tequila before they go out and fight, and then go out there and just like bite the head off a chicken and then go try and kill the guy they're fighting. So that said, the last thing I want to do that I really wanted to get into, and Jeff talked a little bit about it, is the making of this film. Like I said, the film was made for $38 million, and personally, I don't think looking at the movie that you could tell that it was made for $38 million.
It looked big budget, and I will say, like, I didn't even realize how much CGI they were using until you guys brought it up, because the only evident CGI I noticed, and I usually have a pretty good eye for this sort of thing, was the fire on Lauda's car, because like that's clearly for safety for the making of the film.
Well, and they did do their work. I will say that they found the original cars and modeled most of them. So because these cars are, historical museum pieces, they weren't allowed to drive them and do stunts and stuff with them.
Right.
But they also recreated 4 cars to actually put drivers in. So they took all the dimensions and everything and built 4 race cars for the movie to go with. But they recreated a lot of the tracks and stuff too. They went back and looked at archival footage. They recreated archival footage digitally, so they restored it to put it into the movie. So, like, for instance, the scene with where Nicki Lauda crashes, believe it or not, that whole scene is digital. The whole thing. However,
that makes sense.
That is a digital recreation of footage that was taken by a young boy who was at the side of the road when Lauda actually crashed. And when you go back and watch the movie, as a tribute to that boy, they put him with his camera in the shot.
Ha! Nice.
So there's some really cool stuff like that. But a lot of the tracks don't exist anymore, or at least not in the form that they are in this. All of the grandstands and everything were mostly digital because, they couldn't afford to have all the people there and all that stuff. And I really don't think you see it. I mean, we crap on digital effects a lot, but I think here they were used wisely. They did use practical. They did have shots of the drivers actually in cars, and they recreated a lot of cars. I do know that a couple of them, they were given permission to use, like Mario Andretti's Lotus. That is the actual Lotus from 1976.
Okay. Nice.
So that was pretty cool.
Well, now,
okay, go ahead.
Like I remember the first time I started seeing, like, I noticed they were doing digital cars for movies was Gone in 60 Seconds. Because like we grew up in the era where like all the car stunts were actual car stunts. Like Smokey and the Bandit 1, 2, and 3. They're wrecking 200 cars at a time. They're going like really crazy and stuff like this. And I was so amazed to see like, oh, that's not really stunt guy in Nick Cage's car. That's a digital car jumping over this thing. And I was like, you know what? That makes perfect sense because your stunt guys are paid to take these risks, but they also want to go home at the end of the day, just like anybody else. And I think that is the way to go. And the great thing about CGI, we rip on CGI because CGI, it's hard to do living things. It takes a lot to fool us, but mechanical things, CGI can do perfectly, especially when you got the atmospherics, the haze, the water, like in the rain, having the water, the particle, we got all the particle manipulations, do all that. They can do it perfectly now.
I think you would have been hard pressed to find a race car driver who would have wanted to been in an actual authentic recreation of a 1976 car getting in some of those crashes, like a stunt driver. I mean, a stunt driver.
Yeah, not those go-karts with a fiberglass body stuck on top of them.
Hey, the one thing I could say before I go to Steve real quick, the one thing I could say about the 1970 cars, at least they were strapped in, because in the 1960s, it was considered unsafe to be strapped into the car.
But then you fly out of the car.
Yes, because they figured it would be unsafe for you to roll in the car. So,
Yeah, but that's how most people die when a car rolls, is they fly out of the car.
Yeah. Well,
And then the car rolls on top of them.
yes. Steve, what did you think of the movie making in this film? You okay?
Yeah, I'm struggling a little bit.
Yeah, I know. If you need to go, man, that's fine.
Yeah, I think I will.
Okay.
I'll just give you some final thoughts and then go. This
Okay.
was a really good movie. I think Ron Howard did a very good job arranging the shots. It felt like the time and the place, and all the actors are really good at it.
Cool. All right, man. You take care, okay? And let me know how you're doing. All right.
Yeah.
We'll talk to you soon.
Sure. Bye.
Bye, Steve. All right. So, yeah, I hope Steve's feeling better. I know a little bit about what's going on, and all my thoughts to Steve.
I didn't realize he wasn't feeling well.
Yeah. We can talk about it afterwards, but
sure.
So, yeah, I think they did a really good job with that. Also, what did you think of their use of the music in the film? Because I know that's the thing that we have sometimes praised and sometimes criticized when they license music, like actual songs to bring into the film. Did you think it overshadowed the film at all, or do you think it worked well?
I didn't think so, and I'll say this because if a movie's really got my attention, sometimes I barely notice the music, and I remember like a couple of scenes here and a couple of songs, but for the most part, the soundtrack has just become part of the overall experience, and I'm sure it did its job at the time, that it helped it get the proper emotions out of me while it was going on. But I really remember very little of the music because I was so enamored of the story while I was watching it.
I agree. I think sometimes it could be a distraction, or it can overpower. For instance, I like Peacemaker, but it is quite obvious to me that James Gunn likes his music, and he likes his
mixtapes, don't he?
Yeah, and he likes us to know that he likes his music. So it's like we are going to know what's on James Gunn's playlist, whether we want to.
What's
or
lucky
not.
for James Gunn is I am also a child of the '80s, so I'm like right there. Yeah, I love Fleetwood Mac too. Play the chain.
Yeah, it's like you can play all the music you want because I love it. But it's very obvious. It's like whether you love it or not, James is going to give it to you. So you better love it. So, yeah, I didn't get that impression here. I thought that what they did do is use music that was appropriate for the time and fit what was going on. And I think it worked well in the background.
I mean, like the perfect example is Hunt wins, and what they do, they play David Bowie's Fame. Mm-hmm. That was a perfect musical cue for seeing him enjoy his celebrity.
Right.
Perfect. And like the lyrics go so well with everything Hunt's about. A perfect musical choice if you're going to use a piece of licensed material.
Which leads me directly into the last thing I want to talk about before we go, which is the direction of the film. I think it's pretty much, most people would say that Ron Howard is a master at his craft.
I was going to say he is a master director.
And I think once again, he shows it here. I wanted to get your opinion on it, but I think that the way he cuts the scenes, the way he brings them together, the way he blends stuff in, the shots, the cinematography, it's all absolutely beautiful.
Do you happen to know if he goes in the editing bay or if he has an editor?
I have no clue. I will look and see if there's a credit for editing.
Some directors, they've got editors they've worked with forever who they trust, and it's just like some directors like James Cameron, he's the guy behind the camera. Others have really good cinematographers they trust. For this, I really enjoyed the way the film was edited. Like I mentioned before, some of the shots were so very impressive. Knowing when to hold on the character, knowing when to use those close-ups, knowing when to use those wide shots. And as far as the editing went, I particularly enjoyed the way they edited the racing part. This was a good time to have some quick cuts here and there because Indy racing, Formula One racing, is so fast and frenetic. Like I said, it's nothing like NASCAR racing where it's all about people kind of jockeying position in the draft. Here you were doing so much more, and so much more dangerous. And I really felt the impact of that watching the way it was edited. The cars aren't going 170 miles an hour for real on the track, but the editing makes it feel like that. And it's all very cleverly and very purposely done. And so I really appreciate how that went.
So I just looked it up.
Mm-hmm.
He did not edit. The director of photography is a man named Anthony Dodd Mantle, who was the cinematography, who did Slumdog Millionaire and The Last King of Scotland.
Okay.
And then
very good visual films.
The two editors on the film were Daniel Hanley, who did Apollo 13. He did Frost Nixon, A Beautiful Mind. So this guy...
Apollo 13, was that another Ron Howard film?
Yes, it was.
Okay, so yeah, he's worked with these guys before.
And then Mike Hill was the other one who did the editing, and he also worked on Apollo 13. So these are the guys.
Okay, so he's got a trusted crew he works with, and so that makes all the difference. Because Howard clearly knows his stuff, and I don't know how much direction he gives versus how much he lets the actors do, because actors are very particular. Some actors like to be directed. Some actors just like you as the director to arrange the playground for them, if you will. But he's got an impressive track record, so we can't knock the fact that Ron really knows what he's doing here. And like I said before, you can see it in every single frame of the film. And this goes out not just to Mr. Howard, but to everybody involved, because filmmaking is probably the most collaborative effort there is out there. You've got hundreds of people working together to put out a product to entertain us. And it's just a thing of beauty, man. Like, this film moved me. I was not expecting to enjoy this film like this.
I'm so glad you said that, because that's what I was hoping for, because it is a Formula One movie, and it appeals to me on a Formula One level, but I think it's so much more than that, so. And I think a large part of that is Ron Howard. He's very good at making these films about people, but making it relatable. So even though it's a drama, you get sucked into it. Another one is Apollo 13, which I think is a great film. An absolutely great film.
So, I love the stuff he did with NASA during those years. He was doing the Apollo and the other things, because I had aspirations as a very young child of being an astronaut, and I studied up on that for quite a while. As a matter of fact, my dad got this 45-inch record, which I used to play till the needle was about to wear through it, on my Fisher-Price record player, and it was Mission Control at Houston talking to the astronauts on the moon. I used to play that thing over and over and over again. So,
I wanted to go to space camp so bad when I was a kid. So
Ron, like, living in the era that he grew up in, you can see that reflected here, because these are things that he grew up with. He grew up with the Apollo missions. He grew up in the time of this period, the 70s, with these big events going on. And I really feel like these are love letters to moments that had a great deal of impact in his life, and he wants to share with us how he felt through these events and these people.
Well, this definitely was a passion project for him that he took
clearly
on. It was the first F1 movie since Grand Prix, which starred James Garner back in the 60s.
That's been a while, yeah.
Yeah, that's not a bad movie. It's pretty good, actually. But completely different era of film. Completely.
I would like to this time bring up Emilio Estevez in Free Jack, because it does start off with some Formula One.
Yes, Free Jack, also starring
Mick Jagger.
Mick Jagger, yes. And then there was a movie,
and Anthony Hopkins.
Oh, I don't want to get. There's all sorts of racing movies, some better than others. So,
everybody should go see Grease Lightning, about how NASCAR happened with moonshiners and Richard Pryor.
I love I like watching NASCAR. In fact, I have a NASCAR track about 20 minutes up the road, and we go to the races sometimes. So, and I live in California, so yes, there's NASCAR in California. Everybody. What was I going to say? another thing, real quick before we go, there was tentative talks, believe it or not. So in the film and in real life, James Hunt's wife left him for Richard Burton.
Yes.
And that actually did happen. There were talks of having Russell Crowe come in to play Richard Burton for a compensation with Chris Hemsworth's James Hunt.
Wouldn't that have been interesting?
Yes. So I would have liked to have seen that. So that would have been very, very interesting. So with that, let's give this one a score. I'm kind of curious. I want to hear, what you would give it a score of. So out of 10. Or do you just want to go thumbs up, thumb down? Would you recommend this movie to people?
I'm okay with scoring. We haven't scored in a while.
Yeah.
And I'm just replaying things in my head, and I'm thinking about everything in the film. And I always hate to give a film a 10 out of 10 because I always feel like I'm probably forgetting something. But on reflection, I cannot think of a single thing that I could call forth as a flaw. So I'm going to drop a 10 on it.
I'm tempted to give it a 10 as well. And the only reason I would give it a 9 is just because it may not be everyone's cup of tea. If I'm just grading for myself, I would give it a 10.
Yes, it is. This film wasn't my cup of tea, and I love it now. So it's everybody's cup of tea.
So I would say, judging by that, and I think Steve, even though it's not really his cup of tea, he got a lot out of it as well.
He definitely enjoyed it.
Yeah. So I think it's worth checking out. It's a small film. I don't think a lot of people heard about it. A lot of people didn't see it. And I think it's an enjoyable film. And it's a great example of film making as well. So there's a lot to take out of it, even if you're not a fan of Formula One or racing or anything like that. So, yeah, really cool.
Good character-driven story.
Yep. So with that, we're going to wrap up. I will say that we are going to have one more movie before we launch into full-on Christmas mode or holiday mode. We are going to be doing The Great Escape, starring Steve McQueen and, as I mentioned before, James Garner, among others. So we're going to be talking. Donald Pleasance is in that film. We're going to be talking about that in honor of Veterans Day, which has already passed. But we needed to do something for Veterans Day, and I would love to do that, especially since one of the last World War II veterans, I forget his name, unfortunately, but he was a parachuter for the 101st. He died at the grand old age of 101. Very appropriate today. So, thank you, sir. Thank you for all that you did. I wish I could remember your name, but absolutely. So with that, on behalf of myself, Steve and Jeff, I want to say thank you, everybody, and tune in next week for The Great Escape. And till then, keep the popcorn warm, keep it fresh, go watch movies, and let us know what you think on social media, everywhere else. And this has been Cinema Crusaders. Thanks, everybody.